You are indeed watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side Live. One of your hosts, Eugene Puryear. Very happy to be back with you and to be alongside my co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, good to be here with you.
It's always good to be on with you, Eugene. Another Thursday, another Freedom Side.
Well, you might say it's my pleasure. Of course.
The pleasure is all yours, Eugene.
Thank you.
Yeah.
But yeah, of course, we have tons for you here in the show, as we always do. The fantastic lineup. We're going to be talking about the Super Bowl and labor issues surrounding that, developers trying to destroy African burial grounds. We're going to talk about the ongoing crisis in Eastern Europe, the NATO saber rattling. We're going to be talking about the murder of Amir Locke by the police in Minneapolis, the skyrocketing cost of different types of food, especially chicken, by the way, has just been shooting through the roof here in the United States. So we have a very full schedule here. We're also going to be talking about the Olympics, of course, which continue to be ongoing in China, the Winter Olympics. So there's a huge range of things that are out there. And so I would ask, wherever you may be watching, if you go ahead and hit that share button so whoever's following you can follow us with all of our excellent guests. And then, of course, if you're watching on YouTube, or if you want to just go to YouTube, make sure you hit the subscribe button, hit the bell so you can get the alerts and all of the fantastic content we have coming out from Breakthrough News. And we have all sorts of great content, including we're still dropping a few things in relationship to Rania, your recent trip to Cuba. We'll even have a few more things in the Horn of Africa, in addition to all of our relevant coverage, working on some great stuff, both international, local, and regional. So hit subscribe, hit the bell, get the alerts, and you can go to patreon.com/breakthrough-news. That's patreon.com/breakthrough-news and become a patron. That is an ongoing donor, and we appreciate all our existing patrons. Your patronage has been crucial to us really being able to do this project, and we've been more than happy to have more folks helping us. You can go to breakthroughnews.org, make a one-time donation. We really appreciate everybody's support in any way you have been able to give it. And Rania, please, if you would, explain the chat function.
So for those who are already patrons or aren't, and you're wondering how else you can more immediately support the show, you can throw money into the super chat if you're watching live on YouTube. And if you leave a comment and there is time and we like your comment, we'll read it on air. And I get to decide which comments get to be read, which for whatever reason, makes me very happy. Every week I say this and I get really excited. Any power that I'm allowed to have, I get a little crazy with. So leave your comments.
And that is exactly why we limit the amount of power that you are allowed to have.
It's probably good that you do this.
Excellent. Well, we want to turn to our first guest and, of course, our first topic, and that is the ongoing situation in Eastern Europe, NATO saber rattling. And we are very happy to be joined here as we continue the show by our colleague here, Breakthrough News, Brian Becker, who is the host of the Socials program, among many other things. Brian, thank you so much for joining us here on the show.
Glad to be here.
Very happy to have you. Obviously, this crisis, I don't know exactly what we should call it, continues to roll on. Some interesting developments yesterday, and this is where I wanted to start. In the Wall Street Journal, there was an article that came out saying that President Zelensky communicated with President Biden, stressed that he does not believe a Russian invasion is imminent, and said that the Ukrainian economy is suffering because of America's warmongering over a potential Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I just thought that was so notable, Brian, because, you know, the way it's put in the U.S. media is like, well, this is all, the U.S. is just trying to help Ukraine against this horrible Russian menace. But it seems that the Ukrainian president feels like they're doing as much damage as good.
More damage, much more damage. Yeah, it's really something. Zelensky reached out to Biden, but it's not the first time. He's been saying for weeks, basically, stop trying to help us, at least like this, because you're actually destroying us. And it's quite clear that Ukraine feels rightly that Ukraine and the people of Ukraine are sort of a pawn on a geostrategic chessboard. And like all pawns, they don't have any say in the game. They're expendable. They don't want to be expendable. Of course, the idea that NATO would move into their country or put advanced missiles with a flight time of 2 or 3 or 5 minutes to their targets in Russia, that doesn't make them safer. That doesn't make them safer, because that means if a war happens between the United States and Russia, it will take place in Ukraine, and Ukraine and its people will be incinerated. So it's such a gross, diabolical, cynical manipulation of what is presented to the American people as defense against Russian aggression, when it's just one more step in U.S. imperial aggression against Russia. And it's been going on for so long, and I hope we get a chance to talk about it. I do want to mention that there's something of a debate in American media, and it's very meager, as always happens in American media, because it's always about tactics. Like the idea is America is right, America is just, it's doing the right thing, but there should be a discussion or a debate about some of the tactics. Of course, Russia's the aggressor and America's on the side of righteous justice, but there's a debate about tactics. And the tactic is, should the United States have actually expanded NATO after the dissolution of the Soviet Union? And a great deal is made about this because the people, this kind of timid, sort of on the sidelines critique of American policy said, look, after Russia was dissolved, after the Warsaw Pact, which was the Soviet socialist camp equivalent of NATO, the military alignment of the socialist governments of Eastern and Central Europe with the Soviet Union, after it was dissolved, didn't NATO just dissolve itself since the threat was gone? But the reality is NATO has never been responsive to a threat from the Soviet Union or those countries. In fact, The Nation magazine has a front page article today calling it a strategic blunder not to have dissolved NATO after the Cold War, or at least reduced it, because they said, look, NATO was created in 1949 in response to the Soviet Warsaw Pact threat. Well, NATO was formed in 1949. The Warsaw Pact was only formed in 1955. That's an important fact. Mm-hmm. In 1954, the year before the Warsaw Pact was created, the Soviet leadership, this was a year after Stalin died, offered NATO two things. One, they supported German reunification in 1954. The Soviets supported the reunification of Germany, and they also asked for the Soviet Union to be included in NATO. And instead, what the US did is it brought West Germany, which was the former fascist wing of the German bourgeoisie, into NATO, said no to the Soviet Union, and it was only then that the Soviet Union created the Warsaw Pact. So NATO has always been an instrument of imperial offensive aggression against the East. And that's why the debate is really wrongly placed. It's not about whether NATO should have continued to move eastward or not. The issue really is NATO should have been dissolved not in 1999. It should have been dissolved in 1949. It should have never been created. If you believe in peace, you have to be an opponent of NATO.
Yeah, Brian, I think there's something so interesting about the way that this issue is being framed. I'm glad that you brought that up, in how there is this kind of debate within the ruling class about how to deal with Russia. And that's where the debate, the sort of narrow parameters of it are. And right now, it seems like what's being said is that Russia, I keep hearing from U.S. officials that Russia needs to pull back its troops. But isn't that just the U.S. dictating to Russia? The troops are inside Russia. They're acting like there's troops. There's Russian troops are already in Ukraine. Russian troops are inside Russia, and that's what they're upset about. And they just want Russia to move their troops into a different part of Russian territory. It's like if Russia were to be telling the U.S. where they're allowed to have their troops inside U.S. territory, which I think is a little funny. But this goes back to how this started. And the U.S. is claiming it started because Russia moved troops towards the border, right? So from your vantage point, why did Russia do that? What was Russia reacting to with moving their troops? And what is it exactly that the U.S. wants at this point? Do they actually want a war? What are they trying to get out of this?
Right. What they're doing is really bullying Russia. And they thought Russia would basically succumb to the pressure. And what's happening is Russia is saying no. Russia is saying no. When the Russian government and the Russian military amassed 100 or 120,000 soldiers nearby Ukraine, yes, in Russian territory. Some of the troops are in a nearby country, Belarus, but they're basically around the border of Ukraine. The reason that happened is Putin, as Putin made clear at his end of the year press conference, the one he does every year, 4-hour free-ranging discussion, he said to the Western media, look, there's two red lines for Russia. One is we're not going to allow Ukraine, the former second largest republic of the Soviet Union, our main trading partner, what was formerly the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, to become a NATO staging ground so that you can place advanced weapons and troops on our border. You are a nuclear power. We're not going to let that happen. And secondly, whether you admit Ukraine into NATO or not, we're not going to let you do that thing. We're not going to let you place advanced weapons in Ukraine. So you have to give us a security guarantee. And if you don't, we're drawing a red line. And then they amassed all of these troops nearby the border, making it clear that if there was to be a confrontation, of course, Russia could wipe out the Ukrainian military within days. And if the United States couldn't beat the Taliban in Afghanistan, can you imagine the United States defeating Russia in Ukraine or Eastern Europe or inside of Russia? I mean, Hitler thought he could do that. That was 1941. Well, today, the Russian military has 1.4 million members and 5,000 nuclear weapons. So Putin is clearly flexing Russia's muscles and making a point. This is a red line, because if they don't do it now, if they don't create this crisis and making it clear that this is unacceptable, then if the United States starts to move in some advanced weapons now, the next administration will move in more, and the next will move in more. It won't stop. That means Russia will never have a day of peace, because the Americans, the US government under Trump, the Pentagon, and the Trump administration in 2019 canceled the treaty signed by Reagan and Gorbachev in 1986 called the Intermediate Nuclear Range Missile Treaty, meaning short-range missiles of a 300 to 600 mile flight, and they can fly 300 to 600 miles in about 5 minutes. They were going to be removed from Europe. Reagan, if you remember, put them into Europe in 1981, 82. That created the big anti-nuclear movement because the Europeans didn't want to be a pawn then in America's geostrategic chess game. And Reagan finally agreed in 1986 to move these missiles out. Now the United States says, well, that treaty is over. We're pulling out. The Americans pulled out, not the Russians. And that means they now feel legally entitled to place these kind of missiles on Russia's border. And if it happens now and it continues to grow, Russia eventually will have a war, and the Russians won't be able to defend themselves. And having lost 27 million people the last time they were invaded through the same area, through Ukraine, the Russians are saying, like, no, that's not going to happen. So we do have a crisis, but it's not because Russia plans to invade Ukraine. It's because Russia has flexed its muscles, and the American and Western and NATO powers have become histrionic, saying, oh my God, there's a crisis. I mean, at the opening night of the Olympics on NBC News, Andy Brown, who NBC brought in for a sports competition, says the big question here will be whether Putin will order the invasion of Ukraine while he's sitting next to Xi Jinping, and whether Xi Jinping will go along with it. And if he does, that will be a completely different world. Like, all right, Putin is going to Beijing to a sporting competition and ordering World War III to start, because that's how these things are done. You get to the skiing match or the ice skating rink, you say, like, yeah, let's pull the trigger. I mean, but the histrionic, my point is, it is histrionic. And of course, it's, I think the real reason for it is if any politician steps back in America right now, like Biden tried to do a couple of weeks ago at his press conference, he said, well, if it's a minor incursion, we'll see what happens. And he got slammed by the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. They said, look, you're weak. So if in American politics, it's weak to talk about peace, then no politician dare talk about peace. So when Putin amasses troops saying, let's talk about peace, if they engage him and say, yeah, okay, let's find a way out, a peace deal, then they will be slammed back home domestically in American politics for being weak-kneed politicians in the face of the great danger of the Russian bear. So this is the unfortunate dynamic of American politics.
I mean, it certainly is quite unfortunate, and obviously the stakes could not be really any higher, as you've laid out there, given the issue of nuclear conflict being the real point. And just final question here, Brian. I mean, you mentioned at the outset really the imperial nature of this. I mean, it seems so much of this, quote unquote crisis is deeply related to the idea that there's sort of this ingrained belief that Russia and previously the Soviet Union, cannot and should not have any influence anywhere on Earth, and and if they try to, that in and of itself is some sort of nefarious thing that must be stopped.
This is what makes America exceptional. The United States has come to the conclusion that any other big country, should it rise economically, politically, that it constitutes an existential threat to America, not because they're going to invade the United States. I mean, the U.S. is surrounded by two big oceans. The last time the country was invaded was the War of 1812. That's a long time ago. We can do the math there. The U.S. is not threatened by these countries, but what it means for China or Russia to rise is that Iran has an alternative. Venezuela has an alternative. Cuba has an alternative. The emerging third world, so-called, that wants to be independent doesn't have to be subjected to structural adjustment program or sanctions or invasions or occupations, that they have an alternative world to turn to. And so the whole concept of U.S. unipolar hegemony, which is what was, when you look at how World War II ended, the U.S. created the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, and the Bretton Woods Agreement, these four pillars whereby the U.S. assumed that it would be the unipolar dominating force for the New World Order. And then they were shocked because the socialist camp came into existence because revolutions broke out in Asia, aligned themselves with Soviet Union. That revolutionary movement spread all the way to Cuba, little island just 90 miles from Florida. So this conception, this 75-year-long conception that America must be the hegemon, is disrupted by the ascension of Russia and China. American working class people and poor people, well, all American people have to realize that these countries don't threaten us. And it's not even, they don't threaten us militarily. Think about the economy. Trump says, well, China stole our jobs. Well, the American corporations went to China. China didn't take their executives hostage and force them to relocate to China where they could pay workers at a lower wage. They wanted to do that. This is the crimes of the capitalist class that doesn't care about American workers. So let's not be mad at China. Let's be mad at the real enemy, which, of course, is the enemy at home.
Mm-hmm. Well, Brian, really appreciate you joining us here on the show. And I'll just plug again the Socialist Program, your show, which is fantastic, but where you've done quite a bit on this issue over the past couple of weeks. And I think people will be greatly edified by checking that out. But thanks for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, now we want to switch gears here and turn to this Sunday's Super Bowl. And we are very honored to be joined as we continue the show by Taja Riley, who's a dance artist, an athlete, and an activist who helped pull back the veil on labor practices at the Super Bowl. Taja, thank you so much for being with us. Oh, I think you're muted. Oh.
Nope.
This
is always a fun game.
Oh, no, okay. Well, you can hear us. We can't hear you. Weird.
I didn't mean. I guess, is it from our end? We'll have to figure that out.
No, it doesn't seem like it is.
Yeah, if you look, there is like a little microphone.
I can't hear you yet, no. We might have to restart. Yeah.
Yeah. It might just be the settings. It might be the settings and
technological
what microphone is chosen.
Gremlin has gotten us here.
The technological
Let's
gremlin?
Yeah. You know, in World War II, that's what they used to say when the planes, something would happen. They would say it's little gremlins.
Can you hear me now?
Ah.
Yes.
Now we can hear you.
We did it.
Boom.
Yay. Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.
No, really happy to have you, and you know, thank you for your work. It was, you know, because of you that a lot of us heard about this issue of, you know, dancers at the Super Bowl being asked to perform for free. You know, now, of course, Rock Nation and the Super Bowl, they're saying, oh, no, we are paying everyone. There's not actually an issue. $15 an hour is what they're saying. I mean, do you feel that that this is a good resolution for people? Does it still say something, you know, negative about the labor practice at the Super Bowl? Where are we on this issue now?
Oh, no.
Oh, wow. We lost you again somehow.
The sound is gone again.
Oh, what?
That's that technological gremlin.
I know.
I'm going to have to start using that. Let's see
Well,
what's going on.
I have a whole
here.
story about the gremlins that I could tell you. It involves Roald Dahl. Okay, I'll tell it to you since we're waiting. So I said that
I
in
guess I'm
World
going to
War
have to
II, this thing
story
about
with the gremlins. Yeah.
So you know
Yeah,
Roald
yeah.
Dahl, the children's author, BFG?
No. Oh, yes, of course.
So the first story he ever wrote was during World War II. He's an RAF pilot. He was injured in a crash, so he was then transferred to the U.S. During World War II as an Air Force attaché. He starts writing these stories about gremlins. People love the gremlins. He becomes a well-known author. But here's the most interesting part of it. During his time in the United States in World War II, he was actually a British spy as part of a massive spy ring that the British had set up in the U.S. during World War II in order to make sure that the more progressive forces, like Henry Wallace, the vice president, who of course would go on to run as a third-party candidate with support of Paul Robeson and others in 1948, to limit their influence in American politics because the British were terrified that the U.S. would move aggressively to, help dissolve the British Empire, which a number of, these individuals like Mr. Wallace and others were saying that they were going to do. They were saying that, we have to move past the era of empires. They wanted to continue collaboration with the Soviet Union. And so there's this massive spy ring run by the British, and Roald Dahl was one of them. He went all around the cocktail circuit and, slept with rich women and picked up all the things.
This is a wild story, but I think we're going to have to put it on hold for a moment because we have Taja back from what I understand.
Good.
Can we get her back on?
Yes, Taja, I think we have you.
Yes.
Do you have me?
Yes.
Okay.
Had a little.
So I'm going to chime in with your question, or to answer your question. I honestly think that it is a small victory that we've achieved here. But it's just a start in where we need to go in the general work that we need to do for the dance industry, as well as the work on union jobs, jobs that are approved by SAG-AFTRA or trying to follow or attempting to follow the SAG-AFTRA guidelines and the protocols. I feel that there has been a history in the past, as you know, of claims that are still currently open about past Super Bowls where dance artists were not paid well or they were not paid at all. And so I feel like this isn't just a pressure point towards the NFL or towards Rock Nation, but it's also pushing the pressure on SAG-AFTRA to do what's right according to, how they handle these situations, how they diffuse this problem, how they find resolution before being another claim that just gets to sit at the SAG-AFTRA desk and never gets resolved. So that's kind of where I'm at with it right now.
Well, I mean, it seems super important looking at this because, my sort of first takeaway was this has got to be a tough situation for dancers because I'm sure to have on your resume that you were at the Super Bowl is huge, but they're saying, oh, you have to volunteer, you have to do this. And of course, I'm sure when you get there, they're like, oh, do all these extra things you weren't supposed to do. So it seems like for dancers, you're really in a rock and a hard place with some of these big events because for your career, obviously it's big, but they're really trying to put you in a tough spot.
Yeah, exactly. And I think my situation is a little bit different or a little bit skewed from the situation that these field cast performers are in right now. In my past two Super Bowls, the Super Bowl that I did with Beyonce kind of went effortlessly without a hitch, So with Beyonce's Super Bowl, that was a different experience that I had than the J-Lo Super Bowl, where we were brought on to think that our whole job was going to be a union job experience. And then we're met with learning that, oh, now J-Lo wants to increase the amount of time that we work per day, but still pay us the same rate that we would under a Dancers Alliance, what we would call a Dancers Alliance job. And that's been a serious issue. When we get onto these jobs, we are told very last minute in a space where for JLo's Super Bowl, I didn't even receive my contract until 2 days before the show. It wasn't right until 2 days before the show. And it still wasn't right when we actually received our contracts 2 days before the show. They had slipped in little clauses. They tried to make us sign our likenesses away for behind the scenes footage, which is now being used for a JLo documentary, which JLo is JLo, and she's going to make millions and millions of dollars by selling this footage so that she can make money and continue the promotions of her career or to her career. And we're, again, either given scraps or given nothing at all, no equitable opportunity at all. There's always this clause that points to, quote unquote, a buyout, And for the field cast performer situation, I hopped on this super quickly because in the past I had heard just recently in 2021, even with some of the field cast performers in 2020, in recent years with Justin Timberlake's Super Bowl, and then finding out with Beyonce's Super Bowl, that this was also an issue, that they were having them learn choreography, the same choreography that we were learning, and not paying them, treating them like paid performers would be treated, but not paying them the same rate as these paid performers. And so, it's a huge issue when it comes to equitable treatment, but then it's also the consideration of what they mean by exposure, especially in a space where there's hundreds of people on the field. It's not like you're the focal point of the camera time. It's not like you're going to be documented in the credits here. It's not like you're going to be shouted out on Instagram. And you can't even take your social media or your phone, your smart devices inside. So what is the exposure opportunity,
It's amazing just because so many people tune into the Super Bowl. Like, not everybody who's watching is watching to watch the game. A significant number of people tune in just for that halftime show. And so it's the part that's bringing the eyeballs is full of people who just aren't getting paid or are being treated like this. I'm curious, is there like repercussions for people who speak out publicly about this? I imagine there are.
There's always fear of repercussion when facing this. I know that I face a lot of anxiety whenever I bring to light some of these situations, because I do feel that it's never talked about. We're always silenced, and we're silenced through paperwork even, or just the attempt to put paperwork in front of us like an NDA that suggests that we can't report a crime. Wage theft is a crime. It's illegal. It's an illegal labor practice. And I think that because a lot of dance artists are misinformed, they don't know the leverage or the power that they have to kind of gather or unify strength in numbers, and a strength in numbers approach to these types of situations. It's exactly what you need to do. I've been in situations before where the production or the director, the commissioner, or even the choreographer or the recording artist may not want to pay what we are deserving of. And I think that in this sense, or even just putting us in very poor work conditions, like being on tour and having to share rooms with another adult that you have never even really met before, you're just working with them. In these situations, strength in numbers is the best thing that you can do, is the best approach that you have, and saying, okay, 100%, we're all not going to perform if these things don't change. And I feel like here it's really just, this is a victory, a mental victory for us, to just basically expose the fact that it should not stop our careers. It should not threaten our job security to just have wage transparency, because that's really all it is. It's not like I'm impolitely sharing this information or sharing misleading information or false information or making false claims or accusations against anybody. I just want people to do what's right, And that, I think that's the important lesson here. And I think that that's what, beyond the anxiety of posting any of this stuff, I think that that empowers me to continue to march forward and continue to question the, I guess, proposed normal, and starting to shift that normal into being normalizing respect and normalizing being grateful for an opportunity and also being respected in that opportunity. And I think that's a fair approach to trying to change these things.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you know, I wanted to just ask you this quickly. You know, what are the next steps from here? Have you heard from more dancers who are empowered by that? I mean, I told a friend of the show that you were coming on, and they were like, they're also a dancer. They were like, oh my God, I'm gonna have to tell everyone about this because they, you know, have experienced wage theft so many different times, and it really spoke to them. You know, that someone was speaking out. So I'm curious the response you're getting from other dancers and what the next steps could be to help, you know, change things here.
Well, first, I'm going to say I'm really sorry about the technological gremlins. They were probably like, oh, I'm really excited to have her on the show. Wait, what? The network?
No.
But yeah,
It
but
happens,
I
it
will
happens.
say that steps forward, I know that what I'm thinking is to now have a closer eye on SAG-AFTRA in these future union jobs, to try and spread more educational awareness about how to handle these situations in the future. Because, you know, just from hearing from some of these sources that have been kind of reporting back to me on the updates of what's going on with the Super Bowl, is I'm hearing this resounding or unanimous perspective of, I did not know, or I did not even think about that. And that's a dance industry business problem. You know, we don't look at ourselves enough as individually owned businesses because we're not regarded in that way. And so it has this communication or this translation to us as, oh, they only reaffirm that we are hobbyists. They don't reaffirm that we're athletes. They don't reaffirm that we're actors of movement. They don't reaffirm that we are artists, collaborators. We are artistic collaborators with a recording artist. We're not lower than, we are equal to, you know, and we are stronger with, you know. And so now it's about, okay, now we have to start gathering together these organizations that are focused on improving and advocating for dance artists on the behalf of dance artists. And as individual dance artists, we need to start grouping together with these organizations. We need to start cheering each other on from the sidelines, using our platforms productively if we can. And, you know, if there is a proposed window where you can stand up, you know, stand up. I mean, like, I'm standing up and standing strong, you know, not just because of the history of me advocating, but I also have the power perspective of I'm not on the job currently, you know? And so I think this should empower other people that may not be working that specific job to receive the report, the anonymous report or the anonymous source from somebody that's working on the inside, and then advocate on behalf of them, you know? And I feel like if we can build in that way and also, you know, give ourselves more opportunities to build equitably together, I think that, you know, we'll be strong enough or fortified enough to decide in the future whether we need to secede from SAG-AFTRA as a union and create a union of our own, or if we maybe need to work in another smarter approach to trying to maintain a balance of respect and deserving treatment through either forming a label or forming a league, or forming another agency or forming a management firm that's going to represent clients well and protect dance creatives at all costs.
Mm-hmm. Well, Taja, really appreciate you being willing to join us. Sorry we had a couple gremlin moments there, but you know, you certainly always have a voice here with us at Breakthrough News. These are crucially important labor issues. But thank you so much for what you're doing, and thanks for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Well, Rania, we're going to keep it moving here. I guess I blew it there with my gremlin story. I took too much time. But nevertheless, sorry, these are all very serious issues.
I appreciated it. I'm going to be calling everything a gremlin now. Like anything that goes wrong, I'm going to be like, it's a technological. Yeah. Okay.
Well, we want to turn to another story, very, very crucial story here, and that is the attempt to destroy a traditional African burial ground just outside of Washington, D.C. in Bethesda, Maryland. And I am very happy to have here with us here on the show Dr. Marcia Coleman Adebayo, who is the co-founder of the Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition, many, many other great things, an award-winning author, a whistleblower of great renown. But Marcia, thank you so much for joining us here on the show.
Thank you so much for having me again.
No, very happy to have you. And just for those, maybe, I'm assuming there's probably a lot of people who haven't heard of this, talk to us about this African burial ground and what's happening there in Bethesda.
It's an African burial ground that was that came into existence, obviously, during slavery, or what Europeans like to call slavery. We call it, basically, it was European barbarism. And it existed on River Road, right outside of Washington, D.C. If you're familiar with Whole Foods, it's right down the street from the Whole Foods market in Bethesda. And between mid-1700s and 1865, Africans were kidnapped, brought to Bethesda, tortured, forced to work in tobacco fields when they died, when they were murdered, when they were raped, when they succumbed to forced pregnancies. These were the little girls on River Road who were captured in the unfortunate barbaric breeding system on River Road. 60% of those little girls died, by the way. Their bodies were dumped in an area called what we now call Moses Macedonia African Cemetery. It's probably one of the largest mass graves in the United States. And Montgomery County has spent the last 70 years trying to erase all traces of this Holocaust, this atrocity that occurred in one of the richest areas of the world, not just the United States, but one of the richest communities in the world.
You know, it's just so profane on so many levels when I read this story. I mean, the idea that I think they're trying to put some sort of shopping center or something there just feels... I mean, anything would be bad, but that somehow feels worse to me. But, I mean, what has been the attitude of local officials about this? Because, I mean, you all have made this a big issue in the D.C. area. And I'm curious. I know Mark Ehrlich is the when he came into office, he was talking like maybe he was going to do something about this. I mean, what's happening in terms of officials? How are they responding?
Yeah, initially, Mark Ehrlich, we were one of his major supporters 4 years ago, and he promised that he was going to resolve this issue. He marched with us. In fact, the first activity that he committed as a county executive was to stand with us at a demonstration, and then he very quickly lost our phone number for 4 years, has done absolutely nothing. But thank God for an election year, right? And so because this is an election period, he has sort of reappeared now. And recently he came out and said that he now supports transferring the sacred land back to the Black community for proper memorialization. However, words are cheap. And that's where it stops right there. It's just the words. He hasn't called for any of the officials who were engaged in the desecration of these ancient African burial grounds to be prosecuted. No criminal investigation. He hasn't called for the state's attorney to look into these matters with the hope that we would see criminal prosecution. He hasn't even asked the heads of the agencies that still own portions of the cemetery. He hasn't really made it an issue about the fact that they will not even speak to the Black community. We have agency heads that have gone on record now saying that they will not talk to Black people. They're talking to the climate people, they're talking to transportation people, they're talking to all the sort of white liberal organizations in the same area, but they have actually put it in writing that they will not talk to Black people. And their jobs have not been questioned. No one has said, if you're not willing to talk to Montgomery County taxpayers who are Black, you do not have the right to a government job. No one has even put that on the table yet. So Our position is that talk is cheap, and that what we're dealing with is organized crime. And it's the same organized crime that gave birth to the slave trade. This collusion between government and private businesses that come together to make more money. And that's what's happening here in Bethesda, Maryland, and we're calling them out.
I mean, this feels, I think it would be important no matter what, but it feels so, just in the context of what's happening in D.C., where the Black community in the entire D.C. region has been, so pushed out, so, gentrified out, assaulted. I mean, this sort of affront to the historical memory of a traditional burial ground like this, it just feels like part of a bigger effort in the area to just sanitize the region of the history of Black culture.
Yeah, land use policy is the way that communities are disenfranchised. I'm a member of the WPFW board of directors and called the LSB. And, 70 years ago, Paul Robeson wrote a piece called We Charge Genocide, right? And he looked at land use policy. He looked at police brutality. He looked at all the different sectors that one would look at in terms of how do you genocide a community. And the same kind of structure was not challenged 70 years ago. It was challenged, of course, but remember the United States government wouldn't even allow this issue to be heard before the United Nations. So we're dealing with the same kind of structural white supremacy today. Black people, their memory being erased, their land being stolen from the community, intergenerational wealth being taken away from the community, their children being incarcerated at younger age for longer periods of time. It's the same structural problem. And so this is the foundation, quite frankly. I mean, we're foundation builders. Mm-hmm. This is the foundation of white supremacy that we're dealing with right now. And that is the total erasure of a people, the total erasure of their memory and their contribution and their ability to fight back because of a lack of memory. I mean, to a large extent, political struggles and strategies and tactics are built upon memory and what succeeded the last time and what didn't succeed and what failed. So that when you erase a people's memory, you're also erasing their ability to fight back. And that's one of the challenges that we've taken on in this particular struggle.
And so moving forward, what needs to happen? And for those who are watching, what can be done for those who want to help?
Well, first of all, we ask everyone to call and write to Mark Elrich. We ask and to demand that all the agency heads that refuse to talk to the Black community should be immediately fired, that their budgets should be zeroed out at this point until they are committed to talking to Black people. We can't have a situation in a government where people thump their chests and say, I won't talk to Black people. I will not, participate in the discussion. I mean, that takes us back, of course, into the late 1800s. And that's where we're at now in Montgomery County. So we ask people to contact the Housing Opportunities Commission that owns a portion of the cemetery. And of course, the Planning Board, which oversees land use policy. Land is the basis of all wealth. And when you destroy a people's ability to own land, you're also destroying their power base. And that is what the Parks and Planning Commission has done so well in Montgomery County, as well as in Washington, D.C., and throughout the entire country.
And for those who are watching, Marcia, where can they find out more about the Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition?
Certainly, they can go to our website at BethesdaAfricanCemeteryCoalition.net. They can email us at NoFearCoalition, No Fear, NOFEAR. And believe me, you must have no fear to get involved in this movement. So NoFearCoalition at AOL.com.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Well, they should have no fear getting involved because you have had no fear standing up against all sorts of powerful forces in your career. So really appreciate you coming on and giving us some insight into what's going on there in Bethesda.
Thank you so much for having me.
Mm-hmm. Pleasure is all ours. Well, Rania, we're going to keep rolling on here. I hope that's okay with you.
It's fine with me. I'll allow it. It's
well,
your
I
pleasure.
just wanted to check with
it's
you.
It's all your pleasure, Eugene.
Well, no, but all very important issues as always. And I'll just remind you, if you are wherever you're watching, please hit the share button so whoever's following you can follow us. We still got a lot coming up here on the show, and we now want to move to a key issue here, which is who controls the food that we eat, essentially, and how that's affecting some of the unbelievable prices we're starting to see here in the United States. Very happy to be joined here by Claire Kellaway, who's the Food Systems Program Manager at the Open Markets Institute and a primary reporter for Food and Power, which is a great publication that talks about all these issues. Claire, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it seems very timely. I went to the grocery store 2 days ago, and I have to say the cost of chicken is just like skyrocketing. And, you never really know exactly what these things are about, I think, for the layperson, but I do know that there's like a handful of corporations who control the whole thing. I mean, is there a connection between monopoly and the high prices we're seeing in a lot of food products in the grocery store?
Definitely. These companies have a lot of market power, and while there are obviously crazy things going on with the economy and supply chains right now that are genuinely increasing some of their costs of doing business, it also doesn't fully explain the price increases that we're seeing. And most critically, it doesn't explain the record corporate profits that we're seeing. If these meat companies were really just passing on their increased costs of doing business to consumers, we wouldn't expect them to make more money. But they are, and that's a large part because they have the market power to charge more, and they're not afraid of a competitor coming in and charging less and taking their sales.
And when we talk about monopoly in the meatpacking industry, sort of what are we talking about? You go in the store, you see a lot of labels. I mean, is it 15 companies? Is it 5 companies? What's the landscape?
Yeah, consumers definitely face an illusion of choice in the grocery store today. Antitrust scholars consider a market dangerously concentrated when the top 4 companies control more than 40% of the market, and the entire meat industry is above that threshold. The top 4 chicken companies control more than half of the market. The top 4 pork companies control about 2/3 of the market. And the top 4 beef companies control over 80% of the market. And some of these top 4 companies are the same companies across industries. You have companies that are a top beef company and a top chicken company.
So what's happening here in terms of the prices going up? Is this just price gouging? Is it, because I mean, is the cost being, or are the people who are actually doing the work being paid more here? Or is it purely just for profit? And then on top of that, is there no regulation of these prices?
Yeah, so again, there are some genuine increased costs of business. Wages are going up, which is a good thing. That said, they're certainly not going up to meet historic levels compared to where they were when there were much stronger unions in the meatpacking industry. And again, profits are also going up. So companies are more than making up the difference. In terms of, is this conduct illegal? Unfortunately, there's an issue in antitrust law where companies in industries that have become sufficiently consolidated that they can all sort of move together in what's called a conscious parallelism, which basically means they can all raise prices and all make more money and not be afraid that someone's going to compete with them. That's obviously a big issue in concentrated industries, but it's not illegal. The only type of collusion that's illegal under antitrust law is this kind of antiquated idea of companies all meeting together in a smoke-filled room and entering into a conspiracy to fix prices. These meat companies have actually been charged with that and are settling cases around that. But the type of price hikes that we see with the pandemic are more the what they call tacit collusion.
Wow, I mean, it really is.
So there's a collusion that's okay. There's a kind of collusion that's totally legal. Okay.
Right.
Wow.
Do we need to see more aggressiveness of, from the Justice Department and others around antitrust issues here? I mean, is it just that it's tough to make the cases, or are they being a little too maybe kid gloves?
Both. The courts are definitely not on the side of antitrust law. It'd be very challenging to bring a case that said, and this is a case to break up some of these companies. So to be clear, because of what I just explained, some of these issues are just purely because the market is too concentrated, and we really need to think about restructuring the industry, and that's where the DOJ could do something drastic and challenge to unwind past mergers, challenge to break up these companies. They legally could do that. But that would be a huge legal undertaking. In terms of cracking down on more price fixing that is illegal, the DOJ has actually recently charged chicken companies. They've indicted some 10 chicken industry executives, and Pilgrim's Pride has already reached a guilty plea with the Justice Department around price fixing in chicken. So they're doing something, but the agencies have a history of under enforcement in this area.
Mm-hmm.
Like so much in America.
Yeah. It makes me wonder too. I mean, obviously, I think prices are obviously the thing you think of first, right? Because it's what you pay for your food. But when you have so few companies, I mean, I know there's so many workers' rights issues, there's health and safety issues. I mean, does this issue of monopoly impact on that as well?
Absolutely. I mean, even going to the prices, it's easy to think about collusion, but some of these issues we've been seeing with supply chain disruptions and supply chain fragility is a result of this monopolization and consolidation and how these businesses decide to operate. But then, yes, it also absolutely spills over into regulatory capture of the government agencies that are regulating these industries. So we have food safety policies, labor policies that are very much in the industry's favor, and then also more powerful corporations that, paired with the weakening of unions in the 1980s, were able to get away with a lot of union busting and labor exploitation that we see today.
Yeah, I know there's been
Sorry
this
to
massive
put you-
increase. Go ahead, please.
Well, I was just going to say, sorry to put you on the spot about this, but since you mentioned supply chain issues, I mean, I was in the U.S. a few weeks ago for a visit, and several times I and my family would go to the grocery store, and there was no chicken, like specifically no chicken on the shelf. Is that related also to this issue, like of the price hikes? Like, what was that about? I'm still curious till now. I never understood.
Yeah, so meat companies, it's obviously not in their interest to invest in capacity. They're under a lot of pressure from Wall Street to be running, hyper efficient businesses, but to the point of making risky decisions. And across the meat industry, the sort of supply of meat has been edging close to capacity, and now we're clearly seeing that there is a need to invest in more capacity that's overdue. And this is frankly a big part of the supply chain issues across the food system, not just in meat, but a lot of the shortages that we see today are the results of decades of Wall Street driven stripping of supply chains, and cutting fat and really both consolidating the industry into fewer players, but making it more fragile and less resilient overall.
On that note, I wonder how this also affects farmers too, at least some farmers perhaps, because it seems like if there's any disruption, given that it, sort of a just-in-time production kind of thing, that they could be in real trouble.
Yeah, this was a huge thing at the start of the pandemic when we saw meatpacking companies really fail to keep their workers safe and close plants. When pig farmers especially didn't have any place to sell their animals, farmers they can't afford to, keep feeding those animals if they're not going to get processed. And a lot of farmers decided to euthanize tens of thousands of animals, which is just it's an animal welfare crisis. It's a waste of resources, and it's a loss for those farmers. So yeah, it definitely created issues, and the prices that farmers receive today are also highly manipulated and controlled by these meatpacking companies. They're in a key choke point position where they both have the power to raise prices on consumers, but they're always pushing down the prices that farmers are receiving. And in a lot of areas, farmers just have one or two companies that they can sell to and are facing a monopoly on that side of the equation as well.
You know, one of the issues that I think is, and I'm glad you mentioned earlier, the fact that there are alternatives. Things don't have to be structured this way. I think what a lot of these companies will say is they say, well, it's an economy of scale issue. And if you don't want all your food to be super expensive, it's better to just have, 3, 4, 5 companies because we're able to then, maximize all up and down the line and give you cheap food. How do you respond to those sorts of arguments?
Yeah, I think that argument, for one, doesn't explain concentrated ownership. You can have a large plant that reaches all possible economies of scale, and they don't all need to be owned by just 3 companies. So even if you kept the existing plant infrastructure as it is, you could disperse ownership and have more buyers, have more competition between big meat packers. But given, again, the disruption that we've seen, I think it really makes the case for the broader societal benefit of having more diverse meatpacking systems, either, large plants with more medium-sized plants and even smaller regional plants that can serve really regional food systems. Some of the cost benefits between the largest plants and a plant's a quarter of their size are really quite small. We're talking in the single digits, sometimes even like 1 or 2% cost savings. So there are absolutely ways that you can still have an efficient and affordable system where ownership is more dispersed and the whole system is more resilient.
Now, I know there has been some chatter in Congress with people trying to do a little bit more to push antitrust, to get more focus on it. Are there things moving through the legislative process or the rulemaking process that people should be looking into, looking for to advocate around if they're concerned about these issues?
Yes, there are some bills in Congress. They're primarily targeted at large tech companies, but still would set some important standards for, raising the stakes for businesses to merge, for setting up the groundwork for some of these companies to be broken up. Another thing is the Justice Department is relooking at its merger guidelines. Basically, they're not legal rules, but the directions that they give to companies to say if they will allow a merger or not. And as we can see, for the past couple of decades, those have been very permissive. So there'll be a comment period on having stricter merger guidelines. I believe that's currently open right now or will be opening soon. So that's another place for people to speak up.
Right on. Well, Claire, I really appreciate you giving us some of your time. I hope everyone's checking out Food and Power. I can absolutely recommend it to you. But thanks for helping us demystify some of this.
Definitely. No, thanks so much for having me.
Right on. Well, Rania, we are going to get ready in a second here to move on, but we do have a little bit here. Should I finish my story? No, I'm not. I'm just joking. I'm joking.
I think
Juan is laughing
your
in the
Gremlin
background.
story.
That
I was
for
into
Juan.
it. I was
Honestly, that was
really
kind of the end
into
of the story. Yeah.
Okay, well, I felt like you were making your way towards the end. I did want to
Juan,
shout
stop
out.
laughing.
We did get a super
Juan
chat.
is in the booth just laughing at us.
We got a super chat. Thank you, Christopher Cotton. Not Tom
Yes.
Cotton, not to be mistaken with Tom Cotton.
Definitely not to be
confused
mistaken with Tom Cotton.
with Senator Tom Cotton, who literally wants to end the world. But thank you, Christopher Cotton. I apologize that you share the same last name as Tom Cotton. Appreciate the super chat. And again, if those who are watching want to pitch in, support Breakthrough News, you can throw money into the super chat. And also a reminder that you can support us more regularly at patreon.com/breakthrough news.
Yeah, just the fact that you
my
brought up
spiel.
Tom Cotton. I feel like I haven't heard anything from him in a while, and that's actually making me very nervous
which
now
is
that you've
scary.
brought that to my attention. Like,
He's
what?
like
is he
colluding in some
planning?
underground lair with, with like a whole host of warlocks and gremlins. He's
Well, okay, look
Tom
at you
Cotton's a gremlin.
leaning in. I like that
I'm
you're
gonna lean
leaning in
into it.
there. Yeah, well,
I
Roald
like the
Dahl, your
gremlin
favorite
thing.
children's author, also a British spy. I wish I could remember the name of the book. It's actually not a great book, but it is really interesting about the whole controversy and the whole thing that happened, and ultimately the gremlins. But let's just continue to move things forward before I start telling some other.
This is gonna wait. Hold on. Before this is going to be an exciting one. I mean, the story we're about to go to is an exciting one. I'm looking forward to it. I'm just setting it
back
up.
around to another thing I was going to do.
No. I'm over the gremlins. I'm excited for this segment that we're about to do.
No, you should be. We're going to be talking
rage.
about the Canadian truckers. After that, we're going to be talking about the Olympics. After that, we're going to be talking about the murder of Amir Locke by Minneapolis police. So wherever you are, hit that share button so whoever's following you can follow us, because we've got a fantastic run of guests to help us break all these down moving forward. But now we turn to Canada, and we are very happy to be joined here by Q Anthony Omani, a columnist for the Globe and Mail and the co-host of theculture.tv. Q, appreciate you joining us. Oh, maybe he can't hear us.
Is he frozen or he can't hear us? I think he might be frozen. Nope, no, he's not frozen.
It's
one of those sound days. It's
I
that
told you, the
technological
gremlins.
gremlin again.
I keep trying to
You can't
listen.
mess around with that stuff. You can't mess around with that stuff.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we got
Yeah,
you.
we can
No,
hear
no
you. Okay.
worries. No worries.
All right. Sorry about that. I wasn't able to hear the conversation because I was trying to get my sound system set up properly that I could hear you. Apologies.
No, it's all good.
No
I
worries.
appreciate you joining us.
All set now.
So the Canadian trucker convoy is obviously it's become a big
Freedom
story.
convoy.
I'd like to assume that everyone knows something about it, but let's not assume that. So for those who maybe have never heard anything about it except that there are some trucks in Ottawa, what are these truckers? What are they protesting? And well, let's just start there.
Okay, so this began, I believe the GoFundMe was launched on, I want to say it was like the 14th of January, if I'm not mistaken. And the entire point of it was to combat vaccination mandates, or at least that's what they said it was. So the organizers, Benjamin Dichter and Tamara Lich, Dichter is a former member of the People's Party of Canada, somebody who believed that even the Conservative Party of Canada was too permissive to what he called political Islamism. And Tamara Lich is a former cop that's a member of the Wexit Party in Canada, the Wexit Party being people that want to break off the prairie provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan away from the rest of Canada so that they can get access to the Pacific Ocean and basically run a pipeline, like an oil and natural gas pipeline out to the Pacific. So to do that, they want to separate from Canada because their neighboring province, British Columbia, doesn't want the pipeline to go through their territory. So having been previously organizing with the Yellow Vests Canada movement, which was a reactionary, very far-right organization that was against any sort of climate change policy and against immigration, to the extent that they literally wanted RCMP officers to turn away immigrants that were coming into Quebec at the Roxham Road crossing, many of which were Haitian and Nigerian migrants. They wanted them to turn them away at the border and essentially leave them to freeze to death. So because the reactionary movement didn't pick up enough traction in around like 2016 to 2018, they've essentially co-opted the genuine, I think, grievances that a lot of workers have against vaccine passports and vaccine mandates, and have used that discontent to galvanize a movement among truckers. And they essentially rolled a convoy out to Ottawa, the nation's capital, where they've been for going on 13 days now.
So what's interesting about this is you talk about the people who are organizing it. We've seen that, the people, it's become, the people who are promoting it. We've seen it started to get funding from a lot of very wealthy right-wingers. It kind of looks very much like an AstroTurf sort of Tea Party 2.0 kind of situation. But they've really focused on, this is a group of truckers. This is a group of truckers. This is the working class. But some of the people involved in it, from what I understand, have actually been involved in union busting themselves. Can you talk a little bit about the politics here? Because
I think
there's
you're
really
referring to
everywhere I look. Yeah, go ahead.
No, you're referring probably to Pat Botter, who himself was a union buster. So I think people get fascinated, maybe like seeing heavy equipment and big rigs, and they fall in love with that aesthetic and assume that everybody who is behind the wheel of a big rig is themselves a member of the working class, that they have working class values, etc. But no, a lot of these people, Pat Botter included, and his organization created what was called a Memorandum of Understanding that essentially was a letter to the Governor General of Canada, who is the British Queen's representative in Canada, wrote a letter through this memorandum of understanding asking the Governor General to override the Prime Minister's and the federal Parliament's health directives, and essentially, I don't know, like govern Canada through fiat, through mandate, not even via the Queen, but via the Governor General's own fiat. Many of them have themselves not supported other working class movements. So there's been any number of protests that have like cropped up throughout Canada. There's been teachers protests, there's been nurses protests, healthcare workers protests. Just about every union I'm aware of has at some point had to walk out or literally like stand on the steps of Parliament down by Queen's Park, or even gone up to Toronto Mayor John Tory's home to protest, for example, in support of homeless people that are encamped at Trinity Bellwoods Park. I didn't see any of these people speaking up at that time, even though these are genuine working class concerns. I didn't see any of them marching on behalf of teachers, nurses, frontline healthcare workers that didn't receive the pay that they should have been entitled to, didn't receive the sort of funding and protective equipment that they should have been entitled to, but instead chose to latch on to this. And the thing is, the Yellow Vests movement previously broke apart, partially because of accusations of embezzlement, fraud, and so on. So knowing that the organization basically fell apart because it was infested with scammers, has now recoalesced around this GoFundMe, which raised, I think at the time that it was frozen, over $10.5 million. And a lot of that money was funded from the United States. There was, I think, a $25,000 donation that came from Texas. So this wasn't money coming from within Canada. People were using fake names and making anonymous donations. So the entire GoFundMe itself was rather shady. And they didn't put together a budget or anything to show how the money was going to be spent, what it was going to be going towards. Instead, they just had everybody roll out to Ottawa, essentially lay siege to the city. And granted, it's everyone's right to engage in protest, but that's not what happened. When they got to Ottawa, I mean, people who were like walking down the street who were wearing masks had racial slurs and homophobic slurs yelled at them. They went down to a soup kitchen because the first couple of days they had literally nothing to eat because the GoFundMe money hadn't even landed yet. So they went to a soup kitchen in Ottawa, harassed the staff into feeding them, and accosted one of the people that regularly goes to a soup kitchen and called a racial slur to one of the employees. On top of that, there was a member of the community that had a pride flag hanging in their window, and their home was defaced with human excrement. The Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, which is a tomb where a literal unknown soldier from World War I that was picked up off of Vimy Ridge, that's laid to rest there, and where Corporal Nathan Cirillo was murdered a couple of years ago by a right wing or by a fundamentalist fanatic. He was killed on that exact same territory, and people were urinating right next to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. So they had absolutely no respect for the city, no respect for the residents, had their horns going off at all hours of the night. Other working class people that had to get up in the morning and go to work were not able to sleep because the air horns were at 105 decibels all throughout the night. That's essentially what that's looked like. And I'm seeing on your screen right now, it looks like you've got the Windsor border crossing up. Sorry, no, I think this is the Coots border crossing, but there's another border crossing in Windsor, Ontario, which is the Ambassador Bridge. And the Ambassador Bridge is responsible for about $137 billion in cross-border traffic on an annual basis. But if you watch the live stream for the convoy I guess it is the Ambassador Bridge. If you watch the convoy, you don't actually see rigs parked on Huron Church, which is a street leading up to the Ambassador Bridge. What you see are a lot of Dodge Durangos, a lot of Ram 1500s, other pickup trucks, and occasionally tow trucks, flatbed trucks, etc. Because Windsor is essentially a working class city, but a lot of people that live in Windsor work at the Chrysler plant. So you're seeing a lot of people that are either Chrysler plant workers, government workers, etc., that are blocking this road, but you don't actually see the truckers, the big rigs, blocking the road as well. They're not there in solidarity. All of the big rig truckers are actually north of the border, because Detroit's north of Windsor, but they're actually over in Detroit waiting to cross back into Windsor. They're being held up by these protesters. So it's kind of wild that the actual truckers are not able to do their jobs because a bunch of people that work at the Chrysler plant want to, in solidarity with them against the vaccine mandates, basically stop them from doing their jobs.
I mean, it seems like an important element of how, some of this is being portrayed and how it's playing is well, one, the idea that this is like every trucker in Canada is 100% with this, which, I don't know if that's true, but seems unlikely. But also the idea that, working class people in general, like anything they do, even if it's right wing, even if they're part of a right wing movement, it must be part of some, broader anti-capital insurgency. And it seems like some confusion around those issues is having a big impact in some people who I think are in a misguided way supporting this.
No, I mean, just because, granted, there are obviously working class people at these protests. Any protest that you have is going to have a working class element to it. That's just, given that 90% of society is working class, that's just how it's going to shake out. But I think people see that a lot of those trucks in Ottawa are sitting around and assume that these are company drivers. They're not. Company drivers are actually stuck, again, in Montana and stuck in Detroit, trying to move their goods across the border, and they can't because a bunch of people in their pickup trucks have stopped them from moving. Are there going to be truckers that agree with this? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's going to be, a certain percentage of people that disagrees with any sort of social mandate. But the fact of the matter is, according to the Canadian Trucking Alliance, roughly 87% of all truckers are themselves vaccinated. Now, do I believe that a vaccine mandate is anti-worker or that passports are anti-worker? Yes. But is it necessary to align with far-right reactionaries in order to help foment a workers' movement? No, absolutely not. There are, again, for example, 2,000 companies, 2,000 trucking companies that are in the Peel region, which is the area that I grew up around. So Mississauga, Brampton, and Caledon, between those three cities, host about 2,000 trucking companies. It's also a heavily industrialized area. So many parts of Mississauga and most of Brampton is heavily industrialized. So you'll see everything from the trucking companies to a Ford plant to machining plants, mechanic shops, etc. And most of the people in those regions are vaccinated. The Peel region has a 90% vaccination uptake rate. So what's known is that most of the truckers are vaccinated. 80% of all of the truck traffic in Canada is performed by company drivers. So out of all the trucks, about 320 odd thousand trucks that are running at any time of day in this country, about 80% of them are company drivers. They don't own their own trucks. The remaining 20% are owner operators. Now, some of the owner operators have multiple rigs, so they're not just driving their own rig. They have somebody else driving rigs for them in their small trucking business. So what we do know is that in order to be a company driver, especially if you want to do cross-border driving, which about 120,000 of them are cross-border drivers, you have to be vaccinated. To get into the United States, you have to be vaccinated. To get back into Canada, you have to be vaccinated. So we know that of those 80% of company drivers, the vast majority are very likely vaccinated because they have to be able to do their jobs. The remainder, the owner-operators, oftentimes can choose routes and oftentimes are doing interprovincial or intra-provincial driving. So they don't necessarily have to be vaccinated. They have that choice. But the problem now is that you have the owner-operators, which, by the way, an owner-operator, their average, not their revenue, but their income, like after their expenses are paid, is somewhere north of $75,000. And it tops out somewhere in the low $300,000 range. So these aren't, working poor people. They have choices that they're able to make that company drivers simply can't. And they're not exercising solidarity with the company drivers. They're exercising solidarity among themselves. The people that are actually able to own their own trucks, possibly even have 2 or 3 trucks running at a single time. So I think it's actually rather selfish for them to gum up the works and stop other drivers from doing their own jobs. The Ontario Dump Truck Drivers Association just issued a statement today to Queen's Park, Ontario, that is the Ontario legislature, and said it's really funny how last year, when we were asking for more pay and better safety conditions, you basically called the cops on us and told us to go pound sand, told us to F off. But when this movement comes along, which is infested with people like former RCMP officers, former police people, former military people, and get broad sympathy from people in government and from police officers, when it's them, you treat them preferentially and say, hey, we have to work out some sort of a mutually beneficial arrangement. But when it's us, you tell us to F off because there's nothing that we have that we can give you. So it's interesting how even other trucking associations are, first of all, against the blockade, and have been pointing out the hypocrisy in government that has treated this organization preferentially. But everyone says we have to go and align with the people that are being treated preferentially, do have association with police and feds, have waved like neo-Nazi flags, have waved the Confederate stars and bars, have had incredibly anti-Semitic conversations in their Zello chats, like the CB radio app. People have literally been talking about, Hitler is misunderstood, and have held up protest signs that were incredibly anti-Semitic. We should align ourselves with them. But all these other trucking organizations and all the other truckers who say, actually, we're vaccinated, we want to be able to do our jobs, well, forget them because they're not the real workers.
Well, go ahead, Rania.
Well, I wanted to ask, I think it's interesting to juxtapose this with you mentioned other unions who have protested, almost every single one. There's also the issue of like indigenous protesters who have actually blocked or tried to block trains, right? Is that right? Tried to block transportation, protesting pipelines and various other things. So I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about the difference in the treatment that those protesters get versus these ones who, despite all of the rhetoric from officials, are actually being treated with kids' gloves.
Yeah. So, and the land defense protests are still ongoing. If you want to look up the Wet'suwet'en protesters and donate funds to them, or even buy items for them off their wish list, things like hand warmers and thermal socks and that sort of thing, so that they can maintain their blockades and their protests, please feel free to do so. But you're right. The land defenders who began protesting a liquid natural pipeline going through sovereign indigenous territory. So this is not territory that belongs to Canada. This is sovereign territory that was never ceded to Canada. It does not belong to Canada. And there were companies that wanted to run a pipeline right through their land. And knowing that there were safety hazards, i.e. if the pipeline were to ever rupture or fail, it could pollute natural rivers and waters that people actually fish out of and drink out of. They didn't want the pipeline going through their territory, even though it was agreed to by, I believe it was the elder band. So you had basically people on the ground that were saying, we don't want this, but their local government said, well, yes, we do. Well, the people speak. So the land defenders put up blockades, which the RCMP immediately breached and began to arrest people, again, on sovereign territory, which was very wild to me. But in addition, in solidarity, first Indigenous people and then people who were sympathetic to their cause all across Canada began to block railways. And so you had CP trains, Canadian Pacific and Canadian National trains, that were not able to make inter-provincial deliveries. And because of that, the RCMP and local police went and broke up the protests rather violently. Same thing with 1498 Landback Lane out in Haldimand, Ontario, where a land development which encroaches on Indigenous territory on lands that are disputed, which, it's essentially they are sovereign, but the province of Ontario has this recurring habit of saying, well, hang on a second, the treaty actually entitles us to this amount of land, not what was actually specified in the treaty, but what we say. And they will deliberately claim land for development and claim land for logging, even though it doesn't belong to Ontario. So again, when land defenders show up to stop these developments from happening, RCMP and OPP, Ontario Provincial Police, they waste no time in cracking heads and putting knees on necks to get those protesters out of there. So where it comes to the treatment of protesters for land defense, for homeless encampments, like I know people that have literally been hemmed up and injured by police defending homeless encampments in Toronto and Hamilton. The treatment is immediate swoop in, cause violence, break these protesters up, tear gas them if necessary. But where it comes to the protesters at the Ambassador Bridge, the Coots border crossing in Ottawa, etc., it's completely hands off. And I think the police chief, Peter Slowly, is between a bit of a rock and a hard place. He was appointed by the mayor of Ottawa to manage a police force that had its own problems with racially discriminatory treatment, including the death of a man named Abdirahman Abdi, who was literally beaten to death by police officers, like with gloved fists. So putting a black man in charge of the police in Ottawa after he'd missed his chance to become chief of police in Toronto to deal with police brutality issues here puts him between a bit of a rock and a hard place, because the rank and file officers don't agree with having to disarm or having to take down protest blockades. So what they're doing is engaging in malicious compliance. For example, they're supposed to be taking away anything that materially aids the protesters, i.e., if they have gas cans being passed from one hand to the next, so that they can refuel their rigs and keep their air horns going all night. Police were supposed to seize the gas cans. Well, they would say that, well, we can't actually seize the gas cans because there could be water inside. We don't know what's inside those gas cans, so we can't just take it away. So, yeah, it's like I said, malicious compliance, like following the exact letter of the law, finding any loophole they can to not enforce, which again, I believe everybody should be able to engage in protest. So if the truckers want to show up to Ottawa and block streets and make their voices heard, no problem with that whatsoever from me. And I'm the last person, like I don't believe in the idea of using police force to break up protests. But at the same time, you can't look at how they're treating protesters in Ottawa and how police across Canada have treated other types of protests, whether it's protests for Black lives, whether it's protests for Indigenous communities, etc., and say that this is the same type of policing being applied. It's absolutely not. It's incredibly hypocritical. And anybody who doesn't see or acknowledge that, to me, that's just not a comrade.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me just ask you this quick final question as well, and it sort of speaks to an earlier point I was making. I mean, and maybe I've missed it, but I actually haven't seen a big rallying from the labor movement of Canada around this blockade. And you know, maybe I'm old-fashioned in thinking unions are working-class organizations, but it's something I think I would expect to see if this was the great working-class uprising of Canada.
I think I'm pretty sure I saw a news item that the Amalgamated Transit Union, which is the union for bus and public transportation drivers, they had filed suit to defend some of their members from being expelled from their jobs due to breaching the vaccine mandate, which is their right. Like, I think they absolutely should be defending their members. And again, I do think anti-mandate is anti-worker. The fact that Canada has almost something to the order of 85% of its eligible population vaccinated, when you're never going to get 100% of people to do anything, it tells me that the country's path towards getting through this pandemic was just to make sure that everybody is vaccinated. Knowing that that's probably impossible, what were your other plans? So if you're trying to make workers basically become the backstop for your failed policy, then yeah, I'm going to be against that 100% of the time. But at the same time, that's unions defending their workers that have been thrown out of their jobs and are likely to be made ineligible for employment insurance. So not just getting rid of them from their jobs, but stopping them from getting any kind of income whatsoever. Unions are supposed to defend their members from that. What I haven't seen, though, not OPSU, not CUPE, the Canadian Union of Public Employees, not Unifor, because Jerry Diaz, president of Unifor, made it very clear we do believe that our members should get vaccinated, and we are going to support them in any way that we can to make sure that they can actually do their jobs. So no, you're not seeing any unions or large associations protesting not just the mandates, because they'll say that the government is rushing to try and get people vaccinated with mandates, but they're not offering the proper supports. So they're against the implementation of the mandates. What I haven't seen is opposition to the mandates themselves. And whether I agree with that or not, I think is immaterial. The fact of the matter is, like, no, you don't see the unions engaging in solidarity with this truckers' convoy because they want their people, their workers, to be able to go and do their jobs.
Well, Q, we appreciate you being willing to join us and help us get some insight into these broader issues.
Yeah, thank you very much, and I appreciate it. Happy to come back anytime.
Right on. Thanks so much. Well, Rania, you're smiling, so I hope that means you're feeling good still. You're ready to keep moving here on the show.
I'm feeling good. I'm feeling good about this freedom convoy. No, I'm just joking.
Yeah, well, you joking, but it's coming to the United States now. They got one starting in California somewhere.
That's what I was going to say. There's one in Washington. There's one being planned for Washington, D.C. in March. So yeah. I think this is a conversation that's going to come up again for sure, because there's been a lot of lines drawn in the sand on this issue, but we'll have to come back to it because you were about to get to. I'll throw it back to you.
Oh, I thought you were going to take it over. We're going to turn to the Olympics.
Oh, I could, because I actually, not that I don't love all of our guests, but this is one I really love in particular. Tings Chak, researcher at the Tricontinental Institute and a member of the Dongsheng News Collective, who's going to be joining us to talk about the Olympics. Tings, Thank you so much for coming back on. Oh no, we have another muted. We have another technological gremlin. You're muted, but you look great. There are you? Can you unmute if you're muted? Yeah. Let's see. I think we still can't hear her.
Oh, you might be frozen now.
And now she's frozen. No, she's not.
Am I alive?
We can hear you. Perfect.
Oh,
you're alive. There's a pulse. There's a pulse. Welcome back to the Freedom Side, Tings. It's so good to have you on.
Thank you, Eugene. Thank you, Rania. It's always such a pleasure to talk to you both.
Well,
so I'm excited. Yeah, sorry, Eugene.
No. I was going to say at the risk of saying the pleasure is all ours. But no, please.
Well, so you're in China. The Olympics are taking place in Beijing. All we're hearing in the U.S. right now is how Americans feel about what's happening in the Olympics in China. So I guess what's the conversation in China about the Olympics, and how does it compare to what we're hearing in U.S. media?
I mean, I think one of the things about the Olympics is in the Western media, we kind of lose the fact that the Olympics, there's some incredible things happening. I mean, for the first time, the Winter Olympics is being hosted in China, but it's also the first, let's say, global South country that's hosting these games, because traditionally this has been hosted and dominated by global North countries in Europe, North America. So for that in itself, it's a kind of milestone and something that people are very proud of in China. And secondly, we're living in the pandemic. I mean, the wave of Omicron has really hit hard in most parts of the world. So how you hold an Olympics safely with the technology and resources available, and also, I mean, not only to sort of show the world and also build the confidence of the Chinese people, but also try to think about how we can deal with the Olympics, deal with the pandemic and bring 25,000 coaches, support staff, journalists, 2,000 athletes, spectators, and try to do it in this closed-loop system way that's safe, enjoyable, and also entertaining. I mean, this is something that's quite incredible. So there's a lot of pride, I guess, in that aspect of being able to pull off Olympics safely. At the same time, there's all these new measures that the Chinese government is testing, how to try to make a nearly carbon neutral Olympic Games. We know that the environmental question has always been a big question for these massive international events. So how do you do that? How do you use renewable energy? How do you test deploying a whole fleet of hydrogen-powered buses? I mean, the games themselves are basically estimated to use a third of the energy that was used in the last Olympics. So that's a huge technological advancement as well. So there's these aspects that are just actually exciting if you want to follow it from a technological side, environmental side, and also from the fact that these games are being held by a country or by a region of the world that would have never held Winter Olympics. And I think another point is that winter sports is still in its very nascent stage in China. It's not something that has a huge following. So there's been a lot of interest in trying to build this aspect, especially since the Olympic Games were announced in 2015 to be hosted in Beijing. So a lot of government programs to incentivize and also build infrastructure to encourage interest in snowboarding or skiing. Of course, now that's the big topic, but all sorts of sports that were not really known or practiced as part of a larger kind of, let's say, public health interest and a kind of cultivation of interest in sports. So I would say those three aspects are kind of the excitement that people are seeing in China.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you no doubt know, as I think probably everyone knows who's paying any attention to anything, the big story in the United States has become Eileen Gu. And, it's multiple different stories, but, there's a range of people saying she's the worst person on the planet Earth. There's another faction of people who are, excited to see, any young person succeed and do well. And there's so many aspects of this question in a way, but I guess my real question is, can you just say something to how she's being received in China and how people are reacting on that side? But I think also, to me, it feels like a much bigger question. Obviously, there's a large Chinese diaspora all around the world, and to see someone who's engaging with their own culture be essentially demonized for it, I mean, I just wonder how that affects this sort of Cold War atmosphere, people's friends, families, social networks, and how that they can interact.
I mean, one of the things I I mean, I'm a big Eileen Gu fan, I'll admit it. And I mean, for many senses, I mean, the story, I'll just bring a little personal aspect because you're bringing the diaspora, Chinese diaspora question. I mean, I'm a Chinese person from Hong Kong, grew up in the West, went back to China. So in this sense of, her story is very relatable to me. And I think for a lot of people from the Chinese diaspora, this question of the loyalty of having to choose sides or having the loyalty always questioned when you're especially immigrants of color living in the global north. I mean, this is a thing that's coming out, I think, very strong in a story like Eileen Gu. And I went back to her right before our talk to her original post when she announced in June 2019 on Instagram that she was going to compete in the Olympic Games for Team China. And of course, I shouldn't have done this, but I read the comments. And I was impressed by the fragility, of a lot of the US public on this question, calling her opportunist. She has no loyalty because she's stealing from the US for having, benefit from the education, the sports training, the leading edge coaching, whatever, she's a traitor. And I was like, wow, I didn't know that the US, the empire is so fragile in this sense. But at the same time, I think back, like when we look at actually the sporting culture, whether it's, the US in the NBA, the Major League Baseball, NHL, or even, Premier League football in England, what dominates is actually a lot of people who are immigrants born in other countries. I mean, what is the history of that? Because the global north, not only because they have the resources to develop, for any athlete, they aspire to have access to the resources and the training possible. But it's also based on this whole history of, we have brain drain, but we also have muscle drain, of actually the athletes from across the global south. And I went back to look at some of the numbers and I found it surprising, like NBA, 23% are born in countries outside of the US. Major League Baseball, 29%. NHL is 72%. And English Premier League, 66%. So, I mean, the sporting and athletics of the global north have always benefited from people from the global south and the excellence from the global south going there. And that's never questioned in terms of, questions of the loyalty and, we are stealing resources actually from the global south because they were trained in the global south. So that being said, I think that helps put into context of the fact that, that is a long tradition, but it is very rare that people actually choose to go to the other side, choose to say, go to China. And I mean, she is of Chinese descent. Her mom is from Beijing. Eileen Gu speaks Mandarin way better than me with this Beijinger accent. She spent a lot of her childhood there. I mean, she's a Chinese person for all intents and purposes. She has a right to claim that as well. But that being said, it is this particular question of choosing China or choosing to be, have some affiliation with her homeland that is just peeving people off to no ends, But just to respond on the question of how she's received in China, I kind of took a detour, is that people love her. I think fundamentally there's a question of like, wow, she chose us is fundamentally like touching and amazing. But at the same time, like her story is just fantastic. Like now there are people who are so interested in skiing that never, have even heard of freestyle skiing before. She has a huge following. People call her the Sailor Moon, because she's a warrior, also being so brave. And like, there's all kinds of things. Like the Chinese public is just adoring her and feel very proud to call her Chinese, as she rightfully is.
Yeah, there's a lot of jealousy, I think, going on in the US, especially among the media elite. They're like, no, she's ours. Like, we made her. She was born here. And they're just totally losing it because it's not just that she's an Olympic athlete. She's also like this gorgeous model. She's like going to Stanford. She's obviously very smart. Like, she's got it all. And she chose China? Like, what? They can't fathom that that's even possible. So they're losing their minds. And it's an interesting freak out to see. But it seems also like everything China does is portrayed negatively. Like even the commentary during the sporting events turns into this weird geopolitical discussion about the Cold War and China and its bad policies and its human rights abuses and the way they acted about the person who lit the torch. being of Uyghur descent. I mean, there was like so many headlines and so many segments. So we know how it's being perceived here. But again, it's important to ask, how are people in China reacting to this extremely negative coverage that we see in the US and to some extent, internationally, because this is being broadcast everywhere. What's the reaction to that, to all this anger at the Uyghur lighting the torch and at the American-born champion choosing China?
I mean, I think with the torch lighting, I mean, Ila Mujiang, who's the Uyghur cross-country skier who lit the torch or co-lit the torch. I mean, it's something that's interesting. I think the Chinese public, it's just kind of ridiculous to see that kind of news. I mean, ultimately, there's 56 ethnicities in China. Uyghur people is one of the largest of these ethnicities and also one of the actually fastest growing ones. So it is just a kind of a normal thing to think, okay, there's 6 people from Xinjiang representing the Team China, that people are there to participate in the ceremony. So it's not the question that it's so politicized and taken in this way is not something I think that people are really responding too much to or giving really too cares about too much. And also, I think everything has been turned into kind of some political or dystopic. Actually, that's being used a lot by the journalists there, right? I mean, I was just commenting on how quite incredible the whole system of doing this, closed loop system of bringing people in a safe way, doing daily tests and making sure that all the support staff, the cooks, the drivers, the cleaners and the volunteers came weeks beforehand and make sure that they already had been tested. That can be turned into some sort of, TikTok video into saying, wow, we're living in a dystopic future here in China because I'm getting my martini served by a guy in a hazmat suit. And you're thinking, what is going on here? China has had 0 deaths from COVID. Mainland China has had 0 deaths from COVID in the last year. And you're saying that's dystopic? To me, it's dystopic that the US is reaching nearly 1 million deaths officially from COVID. And the world is reaching 6 million. I mean, that's dystopic. Serve me my martini in a hazmat suit. That's wonderful, So anyways, I think
that was the best line of the evening. Serve me a martini.
But that's what you're saying. From the Chinese media, it's a kind of ridiculous, or from Chinese public, it's a ridiculousness that I think a lot of people are also not caring too much about because it's quite far from the reality.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, the reality, it's just 2 totally different worlds, which is why we appreciate your willingness to come on. I don't even know what time of day it is, like 3 a.m. or whatever. We appreciate you soldiering forward.
How did you
and being
do
with
this?
us here, Ting, so we can get the actual reality of what's happening in China with the games. But as always, great to have you with us.
Thank you both. Mm-hmm. I'd love to be back anytime.
Of course. Well, real quick, Rania, I just have to say, I know you normally determine who says what, but I'm going to give a shout out to my guy, Martin Hernandez, who donated in the super chat.
I knew
Who's
you were
wondering
gonna
why I
do
don't
that.
have the top button. And I actually am not even upset about that because that means that my guy, Martin, is fully aware that you should always have the top button. But I got to be honest with you, buddy, my neck's too fat for this shirt. But I like this shirt so much that I'm willing to rock this shirt without the top button because I do enjoy the shirt. So, I was willing to change it up. But shout out to Martin Hernandez. Shout out to Mei-Ling Wei, who also commented on our guests being very phenomenal. Totally agree with you there. Mm-hmm. And Parveen, shout out to you. Some pounds. Good to have some pounds in here.
Yeah.
We have an international audience.
I appreciate that.
We're America-centric, but we do have folks from really all over the world. We've got euros, Australian dollars. We've gotten it all. So we appreciate everybody. Go ahead, Rania. Since you're in Beirut,
appreciate our
please comment on
fans.
the international audience.
No, I appreciate our fans paying such attention to detail. There's something
some
nice
people
about
appreciate
that.
style.
Yeah.
Some people appreciate style, culture, and they understand. Obviously, Martin Hernandez is one of those people. This is, many people do ask me about this, but I do have to say, the top button is not random. It's a District of Columbia thing. So it's a particular form of style.
It's a DC thing.
I lived in DC for many, many years. So shout out to DC, statehood now. And yes, we're going to try to get a tighter shirt next week, Martine. So thank you for inquiring. I appreciate that. Well, yeah, no, but I thought, so much of what Tings was saying is so. I've been following the Olympics, all the Olympics, since the early '90s. I think since the '92 games. This is the least excitement I've ever seen or felt around the Olympics in the United States. I mean, it just hands down. I've actually forgot to check, but someone told me that the ratings were cratering for NBC. I can't actually confirm that, but I do know that for sure. It feels like all of the excitement I normally feel about the Olympics is gone, and it does feel like it is because of the atmosphere.
That's just wild because, yeah, the Olympics are always this huge deal. I mean, I'm not there to see how it's being portrayed in the U.S. I'm just kind of glimpsing it when I walk by restaurants that are playing it, and then I'm seeing like scenes of it online. So that's just really nuts that Americans have been conditioned to just not enjoy a sporting event because of where it's taking place. They tried to do this with the World Cup a few years ago when the World Cup was taking place in Russia. I don't know if you remember, but they even warned American tourists about the honey trap or girls. They were like, beware of the Russian girls. They might all be working for the Kremlin, just trying to get information on America. Like, it was crazy. But that said, there was still excitement for the World Cup. So there does also seem to be, now that there isn't like anti-Russian racism, but there's like an extra element when it comes to China of racism, because people, it's just in the minds of Americans, they've conditioned, they know so little about China, right? Like, at least on some level, there's like a media portrayal, a stereotype portrayal of Russia that people think they understand. But with China, it's like such an unknown that it's easier to turn people off with anti-China propaganda almost than it is with the anti-Russia stuff. So I feel like that might be a part of it too, is like, oh, it's taking place in a very bad, scary place that we don't know anything about. So like we can't even watch.
No, I think that's true. I think that, the sort of othering aspect of it is playing a huge role. In 2008, we had a similar situation, and we're getting ready to move on here, but it wasn't to the same level, and it just does speak to such a high degree how much this push has started to affect people. But we want to move into the final topic of the afternoon, evening, late night for
Ranya's
you, Rania,
evening.
and that is the brutal murder of Amir Locke by police in Minneapolis. I think many people, unfortunately, probably had to see the video, and maybe more fortunately, seen the very large protests that have been happening there in the Twin Cities. And we're very happy to be joined again here on the show by Nekima Levy Armstrong, who's the founder of the Racial Justice Network, an activist and civil rights attorney, and Michelle Gross, president of Communities Against Police Brutality, a longtime anti-police violence organizer. Michelle, Nekima, thank you so much for being back with us here on the show.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Well, the pleasure's really all ours. And, Nekima, I want to start with you. I think many of us were moved to see, what you did there at the press conference of the police chief and of Mayor Jacob Frey. And, I mean, what moved you to step in there and to speak truth to power in the context of that press conference?
Well, as I heard what I felt were false narratives coming forward as a mother of a Black son, I just could not tolerate it. Our community has gone through so much trauma. We have been gaslit, over time as we are challenging the injustices and the discriminatory treatment of the Minneapolis Police Department, not to mention the excessive force and being able to kill people with impunity. It just got to the point where standing in that room, I just could not tolerate it. And thankfully, I wasn't alone. I mean, there were folks like Michelle Gross, Jaylani Hussein, and other organizers who were present, who were asking questions alongside the media, trying to challenge the narrative that the mayor and the police chief were putting forward. So I felt that it was just my duty, my responsibility, since I was in that space, to stand up and to speak up and to challenge what was going on.
And the fact that this is happening in Minneapolis, can you talk a little bit about what's been going on with Minneapolis, with the police? I mean, many people know, but just to remind our viewers.
Michelle, you want to take it?
Sure, I'd love to talk about that. One of the problems we've had in Minneapolis is even though we are, I literally believe, the epicenter of an international movement calling for police accountability, we haven't been able to get one decent bill across the finish line in our state legislature, and we haven't been able to get one decent policy across the finish line in our city that would prevent another George Floyd type incident from occurring. And we see that in this situation with Amir Locke because, this was a complete and utter failure of the culture of the department, the policies and practices of the department, and the leadership of our city. And here we go again, and it's shameful.
And what is it that the community is like? How is the community responding? Obviously, this isn't the first time for Minneapolis. There was a massive uprising over a police killing just less than 2 years ago. We see there's protests happening now. So does it feel like the community is maybe a little bit better armed or better prepared to deal with this? And if so, what is being done to try to hold these police accountable?
I feel like what we have here in Minneapolis is, and in the greater Twin Cities, is a really good infrastructure in place. And this infrastructure was in place before George Floyd was killed. So the community is able to respond quickly to things. Nekima's organization was, in the works, and in existence. Ours was. We all came together quickly to be able to address these situations. And because we work closely together, we're able to step up right away and make the demands that the community needs us to make. So what's your thoughts about that, Nekima?
Yeah, I would agree with you, Michelle. We have a very robust community of activists and organizers who at times operate like a well-oiled machine. And we also rotate responsibility. So we'll collaborate, but there might be different actions where different groups take the lead and then other groups back them up. And that helps to preserve our mental health. It helps us to not burn out because we don't have to be leading everything all the time. There's a plethora of folks who are committed to demanding change and committed to standing up for justice. Just to give an example, so there has been either a press conference or multiple press conferences and demonstrations every day since Amir Locke was killed. And one of those demonstrations happened outside the home of the interim police chief, Amelia Huffman, on Sunday night. And literally, we gave people 4 hours to show up at a location. And they showed up, dozens of vehicles as part of a car caravan. And we were out there in the freezing cold, chanting, demonstrating, and putting together a memorial in honor of Amir Locke that included crosses and flowers and things like that. So it was definitely a joint effort by several groups and committed activists and organizers.
Well, Nekima, let me also ask you this, and I want both your thoughts about this question. A lot of the sort of focus, especially sort of in the national media that we're seeing here, is around the issue of no-knock warrants, whether or not the no-knock warrant should be banned in the state. One, I'm curious how you feel about that particular action, but is that enough when what we saw? Is banning no-knock warrants going to prevent situations like this in the future?
I think that banning no-knock warrants is a part of the situation. That it definitely needs to happen. I think it's a no-brainer for no-knock warrants to be banned in Minnesota, across the nation, and for the federal government to ban the use of no-knock warrants. But there are also these underlying raids that we learned about that are taking place with or without a no-knock warrant, and that can also be deadly. So they need to look at all of those practices that supposedly give law enforcement the right to barge into people's homes, to search their homes, and to do what we saw happen to Amir Locke. Part of that speaks to the hyper-militarized culture of law enforcement in Minneapolis, in Minnesota, across the state, and across the country. Elected officials have not shown that they have the political will to do what it takes to protect those of us who should be free to live in our homes, to sleep in our homes, to enjoy time with our families without worrying about the police barging in and pulling high-powered weapons on us and then blaming us for, being killed. which is essentially the practice that's going on now. They find any reason to justify violating our Fourth Amendment rights to unreasonable search and seizure, as well as our rights to be free from the level of violence that has been inflicted on far too many Black people in this country.
Right.
Michelle, your thoughts?
Yes, and I'd like to add that we brought forward a bill in the legislature in the last cycle, last year, to put extremely strict guardrails around no-knock warrants. It wasn't an outright ban because we have a split legislature, one of the only few in the country where we have a Democratic House and a Republican Senate, and a lot of support for law enforcement with powerful law enforcement lobbies at the legislature. So we knew we couldn't probably get an outright ban, but we put in a good bill that would have put in strict guardrails and would have exactly prevented the death of Amir Locke. And yet the legislature would not pass that bill. It passed at the end that was so watered down, I didn't even want to claim the bill anymore. And this is the result. So now I'm working with legislators to put in a bill that would ban no-knock warrants, and short of that would put exceedingly high guardrails around this this practice. And we see the results when they don't take action. And this is what we've seen. But I agree with Nekima. Banning no-knock warrants is just one step in the whole situation of what's going on with our police culture in Minneapolis. The St. Paul Police Department, though they've got many problems, has banned essentially no-knock warrants. They haven't served one since 2016, and yet they have a much higher rate of solving homicides than the Minneapolis police. And there's something else you should know. We started last year, just really in September, tracking no-knock warrants. And what in that small amount of time, what we've learned is in the 140 or so that have been actually served during that time period, 70% of them are on African Americans, when African Americans statewide make up 7% of the population rather. So, this is clearly deliberately targeting African American people so they could no longer feel safe in their homes from some intruder that could come in the middle of the night. I think there's one other thing that's important, and Nekima, you can really speak to this even better than I. Amir Locke was a legal gun owner. He had less than 2 seconds from the time he was awakened from the kick on the sofa to make a decision about what these intruders were doing in his home. And he was a legal gun owner. If he was white, I am absolutely convinced he would not be dead. I am utterly convinced that, and I want to throw out one more thing. These officers that served this warrant, they put up a whole thing at the court of how dangerous this situation was and this and that and the other thing. And yet they went into this home without ballistic shields. Had they had ballistic shields, that alone would have saved Amir Locke's life.
Yeah, just to Michelle's point, we know that African Americans are overwhelmingly, disproportionately targeted when it comes to these raids and these no-knock warrants, and particularly lower income African Americans. Although in this situation, the apartment building is considered more of a luxury apartment building in downtown Minneapolis, but across the board, most of these raids are tied to the war on drugs, where we see that through the passage of the main laws that made up the war on drugs in the mid-1980s, that it essentially gave law enforcement a license to do these things without there being proper checks and balances, and there being very high stakes for the subjects of those warrants. Not to mention what happens if something is found. Let's say drugs are found. Low-income Black folks are typically spending 10, 15, 20, 25 years to life in prison, even though they're not the ones manufacturing the drugs or profiting at the level of those who are actually responsible. So all of this combined is targeting low-hanging fruit by our state and federal government. And it is resulting in the erosion of Black families and Black communities, and having a disparate impact on Black children.
You know, Nekima, I'm so glad you said that too, because I read an article earlier today that was like the police recovered a range of things from the apartment, including numerous bags of marijuana, you know, as if there was like a nuclear weapons facility in the place. 30 some states, I think, now have legal marijuana. And but just the way it was framed, it was as if like, well, you know, maybe it doesn't look good to you, but hey, this guy was in there and there's a lot of drugs. And it's just that kind of smearing. It just, I mean, we know it's always the case in these situations, but it's terrible.
Exactly.
Unless it's white men with a bag of drugs, right? Because they were demonizing Black and Latino men, sending them to prison, demonizing their families, locking up Black and brown women as a part of the war on drugs. But once white men decided that there was a business opportunity in it, suddenly they've been able to clean it, polish it up, and now they're the dope dealers with the infrastructure, making millions of dollars, paying taxes to their local government and getting away scot-free, slanging drugs in the community. And these Black and brown men are typically still in prison, not to mention women who have been caught up in the war on drugs because of these conspiracy laws. So that's why we say the whole damn system is guilty as hell. All of them are profiting off of the backs of the poor, particularly Black and brown people and people with mental health issues as well. It's absolutely disgusting.
It is. And, you know, and to speak to that also, you know, you mentioned earlier, Nekima, about people, about the way that the police have vilified this family and had vilified, you know, Amir, to essentially blame him for his own murder. And I think it's very important. You know, I want to go back to that for 1 second. This police chief issued a press release in which Amir, and she had to have signed the warrant application. She had to have signed it because that's our requirement under state law. So she had seen that warrant application. She knew that Amir was not ever a suspect in this incident or in this situation. And the bottom line is that she issued a press release. Her office issued one that called him a suspect no less than 4 times in that press release. Then they brought out pictures of his gun, though his gun never fired. He was a legal gun owner. Where were the pictures of the officer's gun? This was the question I kept asking. I kept asking about that warrant. I kept asking about the gun. I kept asking about why you didn't have ballistic shields. You're the richest police department in the state. Why wouldn't you have planned for this? You know, all of these things were things that our police chief, our interim police chief, who I'm starting to call outerim police chief because she needs to go. And she could not answer any of these things and didn't even apologize for having called him a suspect 4 times when she knew very good and well that he never was. And so these are the kinds of things we see culturally in this department that lead to these types of incidents. And like I said, you know, we've got this new interim police chief. That culture is just as bad, if not worse, under her because she's a product of that culture. And I don't see her changing this culture, especially when she made a big effort to defend this murderous cop that killed Amir Locke.
Mm-hmm. Well, really appreciate you all. I know you probably have many things going on, giving us some of your time here. Michelle Gross, president of Communities Against Police Brutality, longtime anti-police brutality organizer. Nekima Levy Armstrong, founder of the Racial Justice Network, activist and civil rights attorney. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you for having us.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rania, I mean, we always say this. I mean, we sadly have to do way too many of these stories. I mean, the epidemic of police violence is just, you know, amazing. Maybe it's not amazing, but it's certainly outrageous. But it is at least heartening to know that out there in the Twin Cities, there's so much. I mean, we had the opportunity to see it here as Breakthrough News when we were there after the murder of George Floyd. And, you know, it really is a strong, powerful movement. And, you know, so many of the national trends we see, especially this mayor, this Jacob Frey character, you know, classic sort of white liberal, so-called progressive savior. But when the chips are down, you know, always siding with the cops.
Probably has one of those signs. Yeah, he probably has one of those signs in his yard.
I almost certainly does. I can tell you he was like the number one, like, oh, I love black people kind of person during the George Floyd thing. But then by the time the Charter Amendment came around to actually, you know, at least open the door to perhaps making some bigger changes to the police, he immediately starts parroting every single pro-police talking point. I saw him go to some barbecue in the black community there in North Minneapolis and say, the people who want this, they're not really from the community. The whole, the whole usual thing that the actual protesters are, white people from the suburbs and no black people want to see any changes with policing. And it's just like, oh, wow, what a difference a few months makes.
The same script over and over again, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Well, that brings us to the end of our show. I was going to say, unfortunate for us, since we're so separated now. This is the only time we get to spend any time together, you and I, Rania. But as always, it was a pleasure to be alongside you.
I look forward to it, though.
We all do. We all do. And thanks to all of our guests and everyone who is watching, and of course, our whole team here at Breakthrough News. Don't forget, you can go to patreon.com/breakthrough news. It's patreon.com/breakthrough news. All of your patronage, greatly, greatly appreciated. All the folks who donated in the super chat, also greatly appreciated. Everyone who's gone to breakthroughnews.org and made a one-time donation, we also appreciate you. And everyone who's just supporting us with your time and energy, we also really appreciate you. And we also support you in whatever endeavors you have going on.
Yeah, sure.
But nevertheless, we will, as always, be back with you next week.